Hey, this is your proprietor, Tony Ortega. And as you can see, I am here live with Jon Atack in England. Jon, thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Tony. Always a pleasure.
Well, when I put out this morning's story, I thought about you because who knows early Dianetics Scientology history like Jon Atack. And, a couple of years ago, we reported on this CST has this nonprofit under it called Historic Properties that goes around and looks for these places that, I'm sure are very familiar to you that are part of L. Ron Hubbard's history. And they buy these houses and they clean them up and they turn them into like shrines to Ron. The best example in my mind is the Bay Head, New Jersey house where Ron and Sarah were living when he was finishing up Dianetics. But now, not too far away, and we had reported this, we knew a couple of years ago that they had bought this house in Elizabeth. But now, out of nowhere, I get this invitation leaked to me showing that in just a couple of weeks, they're going to have a grand opening there. What is the Aberdeen Road house mean to hardcore Dianeticist Scientologists? What does this place mean in that history to people?
Well, firstly, how many Scientologists have the vaguest idea of the history of Scientology anyway?
That's a good point.
So I certainly didn't, until I went digging. Secondly, as I think you pointed out in your Substack, this isn't where the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation was based. It's just the house that they moved to from Bay Head. And of course, Sarah, his second bigamous wife, was horrified at moving from the quite pleasant Bay Head house to this terrible industrial area of Elizabeth. So
Bay Head is on the shore, right? Bay Head's a pretty nice part of New Jersey. And I don't even know how he afforded that place. I guess he must have been selling some stuff to John Campbell. But they moved to a very not nice place.
Yeah, I think he had quite a lot of sponsorship early on because, Joe Campbell and John Campbell and Joe Winter were I think funding him to do what he was doing.
I see.
Yeah.
And so he, I guess that he had finished up writing this thing. Campbell was publishing some of it in the magazine, and it was getting so much of a reaction. Hubbard already had this idea, I guess, that he was going to create some kind of a movement, and so he needed a place to start meeting with the public about it. That was the idea about moving to Elizabeth?
Yeah, and it opened a month before the book came out. It opened in April. Was registered with Campbell and Art Sepos, the publisher of Dianetics, and Don Rogers, and Sarah and Joe Winter on the board. So I did go looking for the registration documents after I heard from you, but I didn't find them. I found a John Campbell article, which is reprinted in Roy Wallace's Road to Total Freedom, where he's talking about, it's going to cure psychosis and this is fantastic. And then I looked to Joe Winter's doctor's report on Dianetics, where he says that he actually saw two people fall into psychosis during that original Dianetic auditing, and that he felt it was very dangerous to give this to anybody who might suffer psychosis. So, and he was an avid supporter of Dianetics. He just basically fell out with Ron Hubbard. He was there from October. He arrived on the 1st of October, 1949. And so he's there right through the writing of Dianetics, which starts in the January. And he starts going, but these claims you're making, they're not true. We need to check this thing out.
Wow.
Hubbard wasn't really interested in that.
So if somebody wandered into this Dianetics Foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey in April 1950, what was it like then? Do you have some sense of what people were going through at that point?
Yeah, well, a close friend of mine actually did the second course there, and he said that Hubbard was already gone from the building. Hubbard had taught the first course, which was like a week or something, and then off he'd gone. And of course, I named my book "Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky" after the moment when the doors to the foundation were opened, and Hubbard turned to Don Rogers and said, "Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky."
So that's where that line came from, is from this location?
Yeah. So,
Oh,
I mean, I will certainly be visiting to make sure that we find the right property and sell it to them, you know.
wow. And how long did things go on there? Did it not last long because of the 1951 troubles he had?
Well, he left Elizabeth fairly quickly. By the end of the year, he's in Los Angeles. There are 5 other foundations that have been set up. One is as far away as Honolulu. I think there's New York, Chicago, and they all go bankrupt because Hubbard basically goes and takes the money out of the till. And then, of course, the New Jersey Medical Association bring a suit for practicing medicine without a license. I mean, he is making astonishing claims in Dianetics to cure physical ailments.
Right.
And, you know, that suit was not settled until 1951. So, I mean, there's this thing where Hubbard talked about people having to leave because they've committed overts, they've transgressed, they've committed crime. He spent his whole life running away and getting, you know, leaving places and getting as far away as he could from the messes that he'd created. So he went from Elizabeth to LA. While he was in LA, he had a live-in girlfriend, Barbara Cloden, who was interviewed for the Secret Life of L. Ron Hubbard. And I believe you put the interview up. I got it from the producers and up it went. And she became a psychologist later on. And she said, you know, looking back on it, that he quite evidently was suffering from bipolar disorder because he'd have days on end where he just sat in bed and cried. Sarah had said the same things, that he would sort of switch on these psychosomatic ailments. And he then, of course, used the affirmations to persuade himself that when he went to the Veterans Administration to be examined, that he'd be in awful condition, but he'd be fine the moment he walked out. And of course, to his death, he claimed a Veterans Administration pension. I think it was $38 because he wasn't quite as severely wounded as he said. Yet, of course, claimed that he'd cured himself utterly and completely. And we both know the 1947 letter where he's begging for psychiatric treatment because he's so imbalanced, which would later be rewritten as him curing his war wounds, which, of course, he didn't have.
Right.
Confusing, isn't it, really?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when you mention all that, it makes me realize that this is a very historic building in Dianetics and Scientology history. And if anything, if it was an honest museum to L. Ron Hubbard in 1950, think of the great things that could be there. It could be all about Sarah and his bigamy with her. It could be about Alexis and the crazy fight they went through. Although that was more L.A. and Cuba, right? But Don Rogers is involved here. That's a fascinating figure. Joe Winter as a physician, first signing on to promote Dianetics and then changing his mind. And then the things you're talking about with these foundations going bankrupt. This could be a fascinating museum about early Dianetics, but of course it won't be, will it?
No, sadly it won't. And I'm just finishing a new book called "If Scientology Ruled the World," and which struck me as an interesting idea, especially given our current political situation on planet Earth. What would happen if David Miscavige was the world leader? And you get, and I come to this thing, and I abandoned this subject in 1996. I didn't come back until I started writing for The Bunker in 2013. I had 17 wonderful years, but coming back to it, the thing you have to say is, and I'm sure that you share this view, this is the most fascinating story imaginable. There's nothing like Ron Hubbard. Even, Count Cagliostro and these great figures of history, they don't compare to the complete fiasco and farce that Aaron Hubbard created. So we talk about the second wife, Sarah, and it's kind of, well, yes, she was the girlfriend of Jack Parsons, but she was also Jack Parsons' sister-in-law. He was married to her sister. Then Hubbard arrives, and we've got this grumpy little letter from Jack Parsons saying that she's transferred her affections to Ron Hubbard. Then they gouge all of the money out of Jack Parsons' account, some $25,000, and run off to Florida to buy yachts. And, he marries her bigamously. He doesn't tell her that he's got two children who he's abandoned. And even though there are court orders telling him he's got to pay money, he never paid anything towards Aaron Hubbard Jr. and Catherine. Just this incredible con artist who's managed to sadly enslave thousands of people who believe that he was, Maitreya, the future Buddha, who before his death would take all of humanity into nirvana. That didn't happen. I'd just like to point that out. But this story just goes everywhere. The stuff I've been finding out about, you've seen some of the chapters about the occult roots of Scientology that I've written. It's just incredible to find what this man was doing. And the way that he, finally, I've sort of broken through and found the origins of all of this stuff. And there's a guy who is actually a point of bifurcation between Aryan race theory, as the Nazis got it, and L. Ron Hubbard. And this guy was one of the founders of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the Eastern Order of Templars, which, of course, Aleister Crowley takes over. And Hubbard takes fully half of Scientology, is just rewording what Crowley had written. And it reaches all the way back into Theosophy, and it reaches forward into the death camps. The philosophies behind Scientology and behind the Nazis are the same. And, it's really shocking. And of course, it created, I remember years ago, when I first contacted Cyril Vosper, who wrote The Mindbenders, which was a bestseller back in the late 60s. And I'd left the mother cult, and I was now helping to set up the independents. And so I was finding the suppressive persons who'd been, fallen by the wayside and contacting them because, I thought that was fun. And I found out where Cyril was, and I wrote to him, and I said, there's a Scientology now that is liberated from the Church of Scientology. For a few months after I left, I still believed. And he wrote back to me this wonderful letter where he said, I don't think Scientology will work outside the fascist environment.
Yeah, I got a strange question for you, since you brought this up. And again, we're talking about the grand opening Scientology is having for the Aberdeen Roadhouse in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where Ron and his second wife, Sarah Northrup, were living when Dianetics was coming out, and he had created this foundation. You mentioned, taking Sarah away from Jack Parsons, which would have been a few years before this.
19th January 1946, they get
46,
together. Yeah.
Right. What did you see in him? I mean, Jack Parsons must have been a fascinating guy. How did this recently demobilized, recently hospitalized World War II Navy veteran saunter into that strange house in Pasadena and pull her away? What do you think it was?
Well, I mean, Parsons was tremendously impressed with him and thought he had magical powers. There's a point where he pins an apparition to a door with throwing knives, with which he is expert, Jack Parsons says. So I'm not sure. It's like Ghostbusters. I think from what I know and the brief communication I had with Alexis, their daughter, that Sarah was very clever, very articulate. So we find, for example, that Hubbard borrows from general semantics, but there's no way that Hubbard was going to read Korzybski. There's no way I could read Korzybski, to be frank. So he had A.E. Van Vogt, the brilliant science fiction writer, who never wrote another story after he got into Dianetics, spent the rest of his life doing this stuff. I was in touch with him in the 80s. But he had understood general semantics and wrote a novel called The World of Null A about it. So he explained it. Oh, there you go. And Sarah explained general semantics. So I think she was, he was kind of cunning, but he wasn't intelligent. He wasn't educated. He wasn't capable. I think his attention deficit was so intense that he had, his library at St. Hill was all sort of pulp fiction, magic books and popular hypnotism books. This was not a serious archive of literature. So I think that, as with Sarah and with Parsons and with many other people, there was a kind of vampirism that he was able to take information from them, which he didn't necessarily fully understand, frankly. But he could repackage it. But then he did say that for anything to persist, it must contain a lie. And therefore, Scientology, by his own logic, must be packed with lies to have persisted. And so that he didn't really understand penicillin when he wrote about it, that he didn't really understand neuron synapses when he wrote about that. He just writes it because it sounds sciencey, it sounds good. I mean, Perry Chapdelaine in, I think, 1951, Chapdelaine was a mathematician who was deeply keen on Dianetics. In fact, when I was in touch with him in the 80s, he wrote to me and he said, when you get older, you'll realize that Hubbard had got it right. And I have got older and haven't realized that. But he said one day, Hubbard called him up and said, bring over a bottle of bourbon and we'll sit down and we'll write some axioms so that it'll sound scientific. And they sat down with a bottle, maybe two bottles from the look of it, and wrote the Dianetic axioms. I've yet to meet anybody who's read them all. Other than, you might have to be forced to read them on a course, but they're not coherent. They're just a lambda and theta do this with gamma and delta. And it's like, yeah, okay. As so much of it is.
Well, I remember when you wrote a column for us at one point about this was an attempt to make Dianetics and Scientology sciency. Yeah. And it made no sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the thing, to take fundamentally the principles of magic. So, for example, the idea of magic is to be able to control events and people through willpower, what Crowley called thelema or thelema. Hubbard just moves over and uses the word intention. And so as a Scientologist, you're going to develop the intention so that you can make, planets blow up and people fall in love with you. Obviously, Hubbard wasn't very good at that. And you take magic and you reframe it in a different language and you make that language sound scientific. Is Dianetics really a modern science? That there was no scientific inquiry behind it. There are no case studies. He claims 273 people have had this technique. Don Rogers told me, well, it was more like 40. And he didn't use the technique that's in Dianetics ever. That was newly coined for the book. What he'd been doing was putting people into deep trance.
Yeah.
And which can often cause, a little remission of a condition for a brief time.
And then that example, I have to say that example brings up something for me, and that is, as far as the vocabulary, the use of those kinds of words, like you just said, they are a way of shaping the way people think about things. So, for example, there's an exercise in Scientology, very well known. You go through it fairly early on, where you're shouting at an ashtray. And I have numerous times written about this. It's one of my favorites, of course. You're telling an ashtray to stand up, sit down, that kind of thing. And I have literally gotten emails from former Scientologists that say, Tony, I know that's what it looks like, but I want you to understand you're not shouting at an ashtray. You're getting your intention across to it. And see, isn't that exactly what you're saying? It's like they've taken this. It's so obvious. You're shouting at an ashtray. No, Hubbard has introduced this term that it kind of shapes the way you think about it, right?
And it actually says in the bulletin, we demonstrated this at Toronto, and it's on my YouTube channel, that session, that it says in the bulletin that you shout at the ashtray. Now, the idea that the intention of the thing is to teach you that words are not intention. That's what you're meant to be doing. So you actually yell at it to stand up and make it sit down, if ashtrays can indeed sit down. So a question there. But look at training routine 0 before that. That's training routine 8. You look at training routine 0 and it says you confront the other person. And if you ever say to a Scientologist, you stare at the other person, they go, no, right. You confront them. And it's tell me the difference between these ideas. What's more, because there was this thing about the famous blinkless TR0, where people were, it says in the bulletin, you've got to do it for some hours. So that's at least 2. And people used to set a timer and try not to blink for 2 hours. And later, Hubbard would blame Otto Roos for having introduced this. But the bulletin says no blinking.
Like, see, these are the kind of things that could be explained at this museum if it was honest to talk about this interesting and crazy phenomenon of early Dianetics and Scientology. Again, John and I are talking about this story we came out with today at TonyOrtega.substack.com. Please go take a look at the story. Scientology has invited people to a grand opening of a house in Elizabeth, New Jersey, of all places, which it purchased for about $900,000 and has, I'm sure, lovingly renovated it now. And it will become a museum because that's where L. Ron Hubbard and his second wife, Sarah Northrup, were living when Dianetics got going, when they literally started creating this movement. Of course, there will be absolutely nothing in this house to remind anybody that somebody named Sarah Northrup ever stepped foot in it. The same thing, I'm sure, in Bayhead, right? I mean, I'm sure you're aware, John, that the first wife, second wife, third wife, and all 7 children have been completely erased from Scientology's websites, the books they put out now. It's as if Ron was never married and had kids, and yet somehow they still kind of portray him as a family man. So bizarre.
It is, and he was a man who abandoned his children with Alexis Valerie, who was born in March 1950. I think it was 1971, but don't quote me on that. But the Guardian's office, about whom you wrote your fantastic book, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, which everybody should read. The Guardian's office, this kind of awful kind of Stasi KGB operation that he got going, they had this thing that called a single-use typewriter. If you didn't want to be traced, a letter to be traced back, you would go to a junk shop, a thrift store, and you would buy a typewriter, you would type the letter on it, and then you would trash the typewriter so it could never be traced. And a single use, we've got the order. It was seized by the FBI, where Hubbard said, write this letter to Alexis, in which he says, oh, your mother came to me and she was pregnant and I took you in. I'm not your father. And, you know, I hope Alexis isn't watching. She does look rather like him, all things considered. And in the end, I believe after he died, they paid her $40,000 not to ever say anything again. And of course, we have this thing that on her deathbed, Sarah, the bigamous second wife, I had no second wife, as he says in The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, the bigamous second wife actually got her daughter, Alexis, and said, switch the recorder on. I'm going to say what happened. Now, she'd given an interview to Ben Corridan, which is very interesting, which is in his book. But Alexis phoned me up and said, I've got these recordings. What do I do? And I said, well, you know, from the point of view of the future of humanity, I don't think it's vital that you release them. And they may very well harass you. So what I would do is make copies of them, make sure that they are lodged with lawyers, and put it in your will for them to be released when you die. I don't think she has anything to worry about anymore, and it would be fascinating to hear Sarah's descriptions of the many magical ceremonies that she and Hubbard did together. I mean, many years ago, back in East Grinstead, Omar Garrison turned up on my doorstep. Now, Omar had written 2 pro-Scientology books. He was paid, I think, $270,000 not to publish the authorized biography, which Jerry Armstrong had provided the incredible Armstrong, you're not going to call it the Hubbard Archive, the Armstrong Archive.
Right.
And they'd got all of this material. He wrote the book, and then they paid him the money not to publish it. And he rolls up on my doorstep. He's flown from the Western US solely to see me without making an appointment, knocks on the door. I happened to be in, luckily. And he came in and he said, I'm tired of them kicking my door in, trying to get this material back. So I'm coming to see you. And I'm going to tell them I've seen you. I'm going to tell them that if they do it again, I'm going to give you all of the material. And then he said, and as a sign of good faith, I'm going to show you the blood ritual, which is mentioned during the Armstrong case in 1984. None of it is read into the record. It's a handwritten document, Hubbard's handwriting. And he said, you can't make notes, but I'm going to show it to you. And the blood ritual, which was done with Sarah, is Hubbard basically cutting himself. Got a big thing about blood brothers, cutting himself, mixing blood, and dedicating his life to the Empress, Hathor, the basically the destroyer of mankind in Egyptian mythology, which was always his thing. He just kept going back to Babylon, the Scarlet Woman, the Beast 666. He was obsessed with these things, which, of course, as we found with the OT8 bulletin, where he's saying the whole purpose of Scientology is to stop the second coming of Christ. I'm going to work with the Antichrist and Lucifer, and I'm going to be reborn as a politician. Well, we're still waiting for that, unless, of course, he's a body Thetan in a certain other current politician who will remain nameless.
Oh, wow. I'm so glad you saw that document. Incredible stuff. And again, that also could be part of this museum in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and should be. I mean, this was just a few years after that, and he's still with Sarah at this point. But of course, it'll whitewash it all and just be a shrine. It won't even really be about Hubbard. You know what I mean? I mean, it'll have his name there, but it'll be this whitewashed version of what Dianetics was, because of course it's steeped in the occult. And I love the things that you've pointed out about all the connections between the way that he wrote Dianetics and early Scientology with what he had learned with Crowley and Parsons and all that. It's all just a tiny example. Crowley and Thelema started everything with 0, right? The first step was never 1. The first step was always 0. Well, guess what? In Scientology, the first step is always 0. That's the kind of thing that he took from that. That occult background is steeped in Scientology. But of course, they do their best these days to make themselves seem like kind of a business self-improvement thing, and not, to me, I've said this forever, the space opera is the best stuff.
Yeah.
And why are they hiding that? The fact that, once you join this crazy group, you're going to be asked to remember who you were on planets millions of years ago. That's probably the best thing about Scientology, but they do everything they can to hide it, John. Why do they do that?
I don't know. It might be that they're modeled in some way upon their founder, who seems to have been a little deceptive. I mean, you mentioned the story about Sarah, and I think it's worth saying, yes, this is, Sarah worked with him on the book. We have a letter where he's talking about her finishing off his stories for him. So she's writing the stories so he can think about this. And that you published a letter. It's January 1949. It's sent from Georgia, where he's visiting A.J. Burks, who is, if anybody was a guru or a mentor to him originally, in that point, it's Major Burks. who doesn't seem to have been a bad sort of chap. But he writes this letter to Forry Ackerman, his literary agent, where he says, I've worked out this way that you can rape women without them knowing it. It's got more weight, there's more money involved here than anything. And there's nothing in the letter about helping people. And he says you can sell the Arroyo Seco Parkway, which I learn is a dried riverbed that fills occasionally. You can sell that to somebody. It's like selling the Brooklyn Bridge. And so that's where he is. That's what he's thinking about. And one presumes that Sarah understood this, living with him. And they created this thing together. She has a child just before so March, before the release. He actually dedicated the first edition of Science of Survival in June 1951 to Alexis Valerie Hubbard. Subsequent editions are dedicated to Diana Hubbard. So this thing's falling down the memory hole, as George Orwell would have it. It's just everywhere. But then he is already shacking up with Barbara Cloden by the end of 1950. And she says, one day he rushes in, he says, you've got to move all your stuff out, Sarah's coming, right? So he's cheating on her. I think you found another woman that he proposed to along the way. Barbara turned him down. And then in 51, when Sarah sues for divorce, and she says in the divorce papers, he tortured me. He one day beat me so hard that it fractured the eustachian tube and I'm deaf in one ear as a consequence. And he says, all right, grabs the baby, less than a year old, and goes to Cuba with Richard DeMille, the son of Cecil B. DeMille. This story never stops unpacking, So, and I mean, Gloria Swanson was one of his pre-clears on the way to making Sunset Boulevard, I'd reckon, where she's just unbelievably brilliant. Aldous Huxley, of course, couldn't find any incidents, and his wife complained about the huge, gaudy box of chocolates that Sarah had brought along. But he steals his own child and then writes this letter to Sarah saying, I'm going to chop Alexis into little pieces and throw her in the river if you don't withdraw your divorce. So, I mean, Blue Sky had various titles before it went to press, but when it was accepted, it was still called Hubbard Through the Looking Glass. And Russell Miller credits it as that, and it was the basis for his book, which is fine because he added so much more. But he's even got 4 of my chapter titles, cheeky man. But nonetheless, you get this thing that I called it Through the Looking Glass because it seemed to me that Hubbard is exactly the opposite of what he claims. He is not creating self-determination, self-determinism for people. He's run-determining them. He's not bringing you to a point where you'll be able to think and decide. All you can do is agree with him. Yeah. If you disagree with him, you get the truth run down until you get in line. And nobody, this is the thing, this really gets me. Nobody has any of the special powers that we were all being promised. That wasn't my interest. I wanted, I was 19, I'd had an unhappy love affair, and I wanted emotional equilibrium. And I'd come from Zen Buddhism. So for us, Geido Zen, magic, don't do any of that. That's nonsense. But gradually you get into this idea, oh yeah, I'll be able to project intention and, people can read my mind. All of these OTs can read my mind. And then you find out they can't. You find out they can't do anything. They're kind of getting everybody to wear the emperor's new clothes and believe that they're decked out in finery when they're actually completely naked. It's just unbelievable. And none of it, we've raised people from the dead. We've cured leukemia. When Helen O'Brien was running the Philadelphia Center in 1952-53, she says they put a goldfish bowl on the counter for people to throw their glasses into.
Right.
And nobody ever did. Nobody ever did. So
you mentioned that 1949 letter to Forrest Ackerman, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
There's one other thing in there that he mentioned, besides the ones that you pointed out. Hubbard also tells Fourth Sacrament. Again, this is about his project Dianetics before it has come out. And Forey is an old friend of his who's been his literary agent and who is just a very famous figure in science fiction history.
Yeah.
And Hubbard tells him at one point in the letter about Dianetics, I haven't decided whether to destroy the Catholic Church or merely replace it. And, sometimes people ask me, when he came out with Dianetics and then a few years later he created this Church of Scientology, do you think he had this whole church thing in mind? And I say, well, take a look at that letter to Forrest Ackerman, because it hints that he might have been thinking even then that this is going to turn into some kind of, strange attack on religion and creation of a new religion. I thought that was fascinating. The other point I wanted to make that based on what you've been saying is, yes, Sarah did record a lot of interesting information, and Alexis is in charge of it. And I just want to point out that she did allow some of that to be used in the movie Going Clear. If you listen to Alex Gibney's narration, when he describes, there's early in the movie, there's a wonderful section where Alex is describing what it was like for Sarah to be with Ron and how kind of abusive he was. That is taken from Sarah's writings. So even though we have still not seen these writings published and it's been very limited access, I know that was allowed to be used in Alex's movie, and I'm really glad that it got in there, because I think it really adds to that film. And that's the only time that I think it's been used. So, yeah, just again, all of this. I mean, that letter to Ackerman should be on the wall at this new museum they're creating to Ron, which he was living in just a few months after he wrote that letter. There should be stuff, all kinds of stuff about Sarah and what became of her. But of course, none of that's going to be at this new museum. And I wonder even who gets invited to something like that, John.
They haven't invited me, and I'm a historian of Scientology. Come on, it's unfair. Yeah, I know how Lawrence Wright. There were the tapes that he got hold of, and I went to. I'm not going to name him, but I went to the archivist that I'd asked Alexis to send them to, and he admitted he'd accidentally given access to Lawrence. So I said, "Can you accidentally give access to me?" And I did. I had asked Alexis to send them there. I should have asked her to send me a copy. So I still don't. Beyond that bit that's been released. As to what was his intention, well, I think you can discern it quite easily. In Russell and I both, between us, we found 4 people who, in the late 1940s, Hubbard had said the best way to make $1 million is to start a religion. Frank Gruber, it's in his book Pulp Jungle, for example. And Scientology responded to that by saying, no, it was George Orwell who said that. It's like,
right.
Impossible to repeat something that George Orwell said. So that early on, he's already, maybe he's read George Orwell. He's already worked out that's the way to go. But there are some subtle clues. In Science of Survival, in June 1951, he says some people are talking about finding past life incidents. Not him. In 1953, he registers the Church of Scientology, but forever after, in December 53 in Camden, forever after, he will say it was Burton J. Farber in February 54, and it's repeated. I mean, Janet Reitman repeats it in her book. I did point out to her that was wrong, but she wasn't too bothered, I don't think. So and then you've got the famous religion angle letter, the 10th of April 1953, to Helen O'Brien, who was the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists, ran the Philadelphia, doctorate course. 6 weeks, $500, and you get a doctorate, from Sequoia. And that they were not admitting that Hubbard actually controlled Sequoia University by that time. They bought it, which wasn't, of course, a university. It was a diploma mill. So he then, of course, his break with Don Purcell, who'd saved him, sorted out the New Jersey Medical Association suit, sorted out all the bankruptcies, was doing everything he could. And Hubbard got into an argument with him in the winter of 51, spring of 52, where he said, past lives, we're going to have past lives. And Purcell said, that's ludicrous, as of course A. Van Voten, the California Association of Dianetic Auditors, the earliest registered Dianetic organization, they were unwilling to accept this. Hubbard takes that on, and I think it was always his intention, because as you look back into it, he says past lives. He doesn't say transmigration of souls or reincarnation. He uses Aleister Crowley's thing. And of course, when we go to Crowley, we then find the magical memory, the remembering of past lives. So he also picks up Crowley's redefinition of postulate to making it a wish, fundamentally. I will postulate that this will happen. And you only have two things in Scientology, really. One of them is intention, that you'll be able to intend anything to happen. And the other is you'll be able to leave your body and travel freely at will and intend anything to happen. That's the lot. And to do that, again, there is a certain parallel. The ceremony that Jack Parsons and Ron Hubbard performed, and I don't know why nobody had said this before, because anybody who knew about it should have realized that that's what they were doing, is actually the 8th ceremony, the 8th initiation of the OTO. It's OTO 8. And that's where the bridge ends, where you're going to be able to stop the Markabians from bringing Jesus back again.
Yeah, but David Miscavige is going to bring us OT9 and OT10 any day, John.
Yeah, any day. I mean, I said before, I'm sure that's why he had 24 years and $11 million invested in watching Pat Broker, because Pat was the only person who might have had those levels. And it's why he seized his filing cabinets when he usurped Scientology. And this is an incredible thing. There is no document appointing David Miscavige as the head of Scientology. How did that happen? And, leading up to that, of course, all of the Hubbard documents that are notarized, including the one that his body has got to be destroyed as rapidly as possible, are notarized by David Miscavige, who was never in the room with him. So the last will giving $500 million to the Church of Spiritual Technology to build vaults with gold CDs in that may last, 20 or 30 years before they peel, No, forever. Sorry, forever. All of this money, $500 million, all of it taken from Scientologists. He had no other source. Well, no, that's not true. He had $38 a month from the Veterans Administration. But he certainly didn't make any money from his fiction. They paid money to get Battlefield Earth published. They paid $250,000 to St. Martin's Press and bought 40,000 copies in advance and then marched into bookstores to get it onto the bestseller list. So they weren't making any money from that. So he left $648 million, all of it taken from Scientologists. And you get this point where, one of the things that David Miscavige, why haven't we got the tech films? L. Ron Hubbard spent a year working on these fantastic films. I saw one of them along the way. It was a pre-release, and it was a recording of David Mayo, who was not very good at acting, bless him, in a kind of, it was meant to be a kind of a Raymond Chandler sort of setting. So he'd got like a trilby on and a big brown pinstripe suit. And he says, it's a lecture, directed by Hubbard, scripted by Hubbard. It's a lecture about if I go missing, then you'll know that somebody's taken the technology over. And that was the last public statement from David Mayo, as released by Ron Hubbard. Mark Headley worked on these films, and Miscavige has decided not to let us have them. Could be a reason for that.
Well, this house in Elizabeth would be the perfect place to have those films on a kiosk just going 24 hours a day, right?
Yeah. I mean, you put up a thing with the article about, was it a Nigerian Christian minister who had visited and said all these glorious things. And I'm kind of going, I have Marjorie Wakefield before me, but I have so often talked about the anti-Christian work of Ron Hubbard. It's not even confidential material. The Heaven Bulletin from 1963. I've been to heaven. It's a sham. It's like Busch Gardens in Pasadena. Christ was an implant. Whether he's an implant from 600 BC with the Nicomedeans or an implant in 75 million years ago in Incident 2 is up for grabs. But, the God of the universe will be found under a rock, he says, when we finish clearing everybody else, like a beetle. And yet they're conning Christians into believing this. And his entire mission is to destroy Christianity. It's eclectic, though,
It's incredible. And in his early lectures, he's bashing religion all the time. I've been through those, and he's always taking shots at religion. And the other thing I published today was it today or was it? Yeah, today. One of my readers passed on to me a invite to Passover at the Flag Land Base, right? And the person who sent it to me said my stepmother was an OT8 who said to her fellow OT pals, "If you still believe in God, you're not OT."
Yeah.
I know they don't, and yet they practice all this. And I don't know if you saw this other story this week, John. It's so crazy. Scientology, they operate the Free Winds, this cruise ship in the Caribbean, which is where you have to go to get OTA. And a few years ago, I was, whenever Scientology would put out a press release about the Free Winds or something like the Free Winds, in 2018, 2019, there was this fixture, this guy named Richard Gamboa Ben Eleazar, who called himself a rabbi and who was part of all their interfaith things. But it was clear he was just hanging out on the ship having a good time, right? It was clear he was just a total sham and a shill for Scientology's, they try to pretend that they're good with the other religions and all that. Well, the mind-blowing news is that was in 2018, 2019. I kind of lost track of him. Last week, Dr. Rabbi Richard Gamboa Ben Eleazar announced that the president of Colombia, the South American country, Gustavo Petro, has appointed him director of religious affairs, and he is now the highest-ranking clergyman in the Colombian government with the power to grant and deny licenses to churches in the country.
It's untrue. I mean, about 10 years ago, there was some stuff about them training the Colombian army. Yeah. So.
No, they have definitely, aimed at Colombia. There's a famous picture of Miscavige getting a medal pinned on him by a retired Colombian general. That's a farce. But now a Scientologist pretending to be a rabbi is the highest ranked clergy figure in the entire country of Colombia. Now that's a grift L. Ron Hubbard, I think, would be impressed by. Don't you think so?
Oh, I think he would. Yeah, he'd love that. I mean, we've got L. Ron Hubbard ways, and we've got the freedom of the city that was granted to L. Ron Hubbard. When Russell was researching, we got the big list of claims of what Hubbard had got. And our favorite was he is a member of the National Geographic Society. And Russell called up the National Geographic Society and said, "Is it true?" They said, "Well, yes, but anybody who buys the magazine is a member." Okay.
Hey, John McLean, thank you for checking in. I want to talk to you directly. Give me an email after this video. I definitely want to talk to you about that. Thank you so much, folks, for joining us. John, thank you for helping me deal with this crazy news today that Scientology is opening, or a grand opening of its Elizabeth, New Jersey house. I wonder what the neighbors think about that. How do they get this zoned as a museum? I better look into that, because I'm not sure I would want to be living in the house next door to have Scientologists arriving every day on their supplication to Ron Hubbard. I don't know how you get that zoned. I'll check that out. Please come to tonyortega.substack.com. You will, if you're seeing this on YouTube, you will see the story we're talking about and the one about the crazy Colombian rabbi. And also, you can see our archives of all the wonderful things Jon Atack has written for us over the years. And I will definitely also put a link to Jon's YouTube channel where he is constantly doing great stuff. I think tomorrow morning I'll be posting a video you did with Jefferson Hawkins. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff is incredible. He signed up, I think, in 1967. He worked in publications, and he left, I think, in 2006. And he was working for Miscavige. And you had this amazing period in the mid 80s. He wrote a really good book called Counterfeit Dreams. In the mid 80s, he's told to get Dianetics on the bestseller list. How do you do that 35 years after this really unreadable book is published? He managed to get it in the New York Times bestseller list. And he says, well, the first thing was to ignore everything Hubbard had said about marketing.
They're still selling, Jon. They are still selling that. They want you to come to the free wins to pay for a week in their PR convention so you can learn all of L. Ron Hubbard's tricks about how to promote things. They still think that's the best stuff. But Jefferson Hawkins proved you can only succeed if you ignore it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book itself, that there's this terrible cloud hanging over that book, because in Science of Survival, a year later, he said the method used originally in Dianetics is hypnotic. You must not use it. And then in 1977, it was reintroduced. And it's even got the bit about the fluttering of the eyelids as you go into reverie, which is the word used by hypnotists at the time for trance. And there it is. They're just blithely using hypnotism with this thing that they've managed to persuade all of the followers that it's not hypnotism. You say to any Scientologist, what is hypnotism? How does it work? And they don't know, but they know that Scientology is not hypnotism.
That's right. They always say that. Yeah. Well, that should also be part of this museum. They should be talking about hypnotism in this museum, but of course they won't. I wish that you and I were invited and go, but we're not. But thank you, Jon, for helping me to discuss this news. It's always great to speak to you, and it's always fun to see what crazy thing Scientology is up to. It just keeps us busy, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Good talking to you, Tony. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jon. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.